A reminder goes out for anyone watching from any country to drop their nation in the comments, and the narrator encourages everyone to like the video and subscribe for more HOA and Karen takedown stories. Then, the actual nightmare begins. The day starts quietly, the kind of slow morning where nothing feels out of place. The homeowner steps outside with a cup of coffee in hand, the sun touching the edges of the sidewalk with a soft gold warmth. The neighborhood is calm at first glance, the lawns neatly trimmed, the houses casting long, neat shadows across the street. It feels peaceful. But so often in these neighborhoods, peace lives only for a moment. Karen watches from across the street, her curtains pulled just enough to see between them. She has spent the past 3 years turning the simple act of stepping outside into an experience, monitored with the intensity of someone guarding a government facility. To her, every small movement is an event, every arrival a threat, every parked car an offense. The homeowner's car has been sitting in the same place for hours, parked in the driveway like always, with its front bumper sitting well behind the sidewalk line. Nothing unusual, nothing questionable, nothing even remotely close to blocking anything. The homeowner knows it, the neighbors know it, and the sidewalk itself is clear enough for a marching band to walk through. But Karen has built her own world in her mind, and facts do not always fit inside it. She steps outside, arms stiff, posture tense, phone already in hand. She scans the street as if preparing to seize someone mid-crime. The homeowner notices her presence but dismisses it, hoping for a rare quiet day. Yet quiet is the last thing she intends. She takes a dramatic stride toward the sidewalk, pausing to examine it like a detective at a crime scene. Her eyes dart from the driveway to the street, back and forth, searching for something, anything she can twist into a violation. Her breathing hitches with anticipation. She has found her next battle. Without hesitation, she raises her phone and dials. The homeowner hears nothing yet, but the tone of the neighborhood shifts. The birds quiet down, the air feels heavier, and Karen's voice rises just enough to reveal her urgency. She begins pacing, waving one hand theatrically as she speaks. The call lasts only a few seconds, but the implications will stretch for hours. The homeowner remains unaware until the sound of a police car creeps down the neighborhood street. The slow roll of the cruiser catches attention immediately, its presence unusual on such a calm morning. Karen stands proudly on her lawn, gesturing toward the homeowner's driveway as if revealing a grand discovery. Inside the house, confusion grows. The homeowner steps out again, watching the cruiser pulled to a stop. A sense of dread spreads through the chest, not because of guilt, but because of the familiar pattern of Karen's behavior. She has made complaints before. Noise at inappropriate hours that never happened, imaginary rule violations, and elaborate claims about supposed HOA directives she alone seemed to know. Every time, the accusations crumbled, but she always came back again, fueled by stubborn certainty. The officer steps out and takes a look at the driveway. His eyes move along the concrete, over the lawn's border, across the sidewalk, then to the car. He sees exactly what anyone with functioning eyes sees. Nothing. No obstruction, no violation, nothing even remotely close to blocking anything. The homeowner knows it, the neighbors know it, and the sidewalk itself is clear enough for a marching band to walk through. But Karen has built her own world in her mind, and facts do not always fit inside it. She steps outside, arms stiff, posture tense, phone already in hand. She scans the street as if preparing to seize someone mid-crime. The homeowner notices her presence but dismisses it, hoping for a rare quiet day. Yet quiet is the last thing she intends. She takes a dramatic stride toward the sidewalk, pausing, to examine it like a detective at a crime scene. Her eyes dart from the driveway to the street, back and forth, searching for something, anything she can twist into a violation. Her breathing hitches with anticipation. She has found her next battle. Without hesitation, she races her phone and dials. The homeowner hears nothing yet, but the tone of the neighborhood shifts. The birds quiet down, the air feels heavier, and Karen's voice rises just enough to reveal her urgency. She begins pacing, waving one hand theatrically as she speaks. The call lasts only a few seconds, but the implications will stretch for hours. The homeowner remains unaware until the sound of a police car creeps down the neighborhood street. The slow roll of the cruiser catches attention immediately, its presence unusual on such a calm morning. Karen stands proudly on her lawn, gesturing toward the homeowner's driveway as if revealing a grand discovery. Inside the house, confusion grows. The homeowner steps out again, watching the cruiser pulled to a stop. A sense of dread spreads through the chest, not because of guilt, but because of the familiar pattern of Karen's behavior. She has made complaints before: noise at inappropriate hours that never happened, imaginary rule violations, and elaborate claims about supposed HOA directives she alone seemed to know. Every time the accusations crumbled, but she always came back again, fueled by stubborn certainty. The officer steps out and takes a look at the driveway. His eyes move along the concrete, over the lawn's border, across the sidewalk, then to the car. He sees exactly what anyone with functioning eyes sees. Nothing. No obstruction, no violation, nothing even remotely close to blocking anything. The homeowner knows it, the neighbors know it, and the sidewalk itself is clear enough for a marching band to walk through. But Karen has built her own world in her mind, and facts do not always fit inside it. She steps outside, face between the curtains. She turns away, frustrated, covering her reaction with a stiff retreat into her home. Her blinds flutter shut with the speed of someone unwilling to face the consequences of their actions. The homeowner stands alone for a moment, watching the street settle again. But peace is temporary in this neighborhood. Karen has taken an opening shot, and her mind is already working. There will be more, and this was only the beginning. The morning after the first wave of chaos arrived with a quiet heaviness that settled over the neighborhood like fog. The sidewalk where Karen claimed the car had been blocking emergency access looked exactly as it always had. Open, clear, wide enough for anyone to pass without even brushing against the grass. But the tension she had stirred didn't disappear. It hung in the air, quietly buzzing, as if everyone was waiting to see what she would do next. Several neighbors watched from their windows, pretending to be busy with morning chores, but clearly peeking, waiting to see whether the homeowner would move the car, confront Karen, or simply ignore her accusations. Yet the homeowner kept to his routine, stepping outside, walking the perimeter of the property, and noting the small details that showed someone had been near the driveway overnight. Leaves shifted in strange patterns, footprints where there shouldn't have been any, a faint scuff on the ground near the front bumper of the car. It became clear that Karen wasn't content with filing a false report. She wanted evidence, or something she could pass off as evidence, even if she had to manufacture it. The homeowner understood this pattern and knew the importance of documenting everything. He took photos of the driveway, the car's position, the curb, and the untouched sidewalk. He recorded the timestamp. He saved the footage from the security camera that caught Karen wandering around near midnight, hovering too close to the property line while pacing with her phone. By mid-afternoon, the HOA's compliance officer appeared, clipboard in hand, wearing an expression of forced neutrality. It was the expression bureaucrats used when they didn't want to take sides, but were already leaning toward the person who complained the loudest. The officer inspected the car without speaking, measuring the distance from the driveway to the sidewalk, even though the car hadn't moved since the previous morning. His demeanor shifted slightly as he worked, a growing awareness that something didn't line up with Karen's accusations. He took notes, snapped a few photos, and walked away without comment. But the homeowner could tell he was conflicted. Karen had been calling the HOA repeatedly, pushing them, demanding penalty notices, demanding action. And the HOA didn't like being pressured. They liked compliance, neatness, and silence. They wanted the neighborhood to look like a brochure, and people like Karen were both their biggest asset and their biggest problem. As the HOA officer left, Karen emerged from her porch as if summoned by invisible strings. She hovered by the sidewalk, arms crossed, wearing an expression that mixed triumph and impatience. She seemed certain the officer had come to enforce her will. But when he didn't return to her house afterward, her posture changed. She stiffened, tapping her foot with rising frustration. The lack of acknowledgement felt like an insult in her mind. In the hours that followed, the homeowner noticed a shift around the block. Some neighbors quietly offered nods of support. A couple of them rolled their garbage cans closer than usual, blocking Karen's line of sight to the driveway. Small gestures, subtle but intentional. They had watched her behavior for months, each incident sharpening their awareness of her exaggerations, her confrontations, her need for control. As evening approached, the homeowner sat down with the day's recordings, saving everything to a separate drive. Footage of the car unmoved, footage of the empty sidewalk, footage of Karen's late-night prowling. He knew this wasn't going to end with one false call to 911. Karen had tasted the attention she craved. She wanted conflict because it gave her purpose, even if the conflict existed only in her mind. Once darkness fell, she returned to the sidewalk again. This time she paced deliberately, inspecting the ground with exaggerated movements, as if she were searching for something to support her claim. She crouched, waved her phone around, muttered to herself, and then took photos of the driveway that revealed nothing out of order. To anyone else, it would have looked like a harmless but strange nighttime stroll. But the homeowner understood what she was trying to build. A narrative she could present to the HOA, to 911, to anyone who would listen. He watched through the blinds, quiet and patient. He knew the importance of letting her actions speak for themselves. When someone built lies out of thin air, those lies eventually collapsed on the person who created them, especially when the truth was preserved on a dozen angles of high-definition footage. By the time she retreated back indoors, he knew that the situation was escalating. Karen wasn't giving up. She was preparing something bigger. And the homeowner knew he needed to be ready. The next day would bring new accusations, new visits, new witnesses. But he had something Karen didn't account for. A trail of evidence that followed her every move, capturing every misstep she tried to hide. The stage was set for the conflict to grow, and the neighborhood waited for whatever came next. The morning after the sidewalk fiasco began with a strange quiet that didn't match the neighborhood's usual mood. Normally, the street was alive with dog walkers and parents hustling kids to school, but that day, everything felt paused, like everyone was waiting to see what I'd do next. Word had spread fast about Karen's 911 stunt, and people were already choosing sides without saying a word. I watched from my window as neighbors peeked through blinds, pretending they weren't watching me step outside to check my car. It sat exactly where it had been yesterday, perfectly within the marked parking space, not even close to the sidewalk line. I took a picture again, this time from multiple angles, not because I needed proof for myself, but because I knew Karen would twist the story the moment she got the chance. Halfway through my morning coffee, I overheard her voice echoing down the street. She wasn't even trying to be discreet. She paced back and forth in front of my driveway, waving her phone around like she was reenacting the call she made the day before. A few neighbors lingered nearby, pretending to be out for casual strolls, but they were clearly listening. Karen thrived on an audience. She pointed out my car over and over again, insisting that it created a public safety hazard and that it was only a matter of time before someone tripped, fell, or, dramatic as she was, suffered some catastrophic accident. The same sidewalk that had been perfectly fine for years had suddenly become the focus of her latest crusade. I ignored her and went back inside, letting her rant to the air. But it didn't stop there. By noon, a new threat showed up in the form of an HOA email. It popped into my inbox with a bold red subject line that looked designed to intimidate. According to them, multiple concerns had been raised about my parking habits, and they were investigating a potential obstruction. The email wasn't even subtle. It had Karen written all over it. They requested photographic proof of compliance, which would have been reasonable if the request wasn't so obviously one-sided. Karen had already tried to get the police involved, and now she had shifted her attack to the HOA board. I knew she wouldn't stop until she got the reaction she wanted. But what she didn't know was that I had already been preparing for something like this long before the sidewalk accusation. Karen's pattern was predictable. Every month, she needed a new target, a new neighbor to blame, a new battlefield where she could control the narrative. I had saved every email she had ever sent me, every strange complaint she tried to file, every photo she took of my yard or package deliveries or guests' cars. It was a whole collection of her attempts to build a case that never existed. Still, I didn't respond to the HOA right away. The board always made decisions faster when Karen was involved, and sure enough, 2 hours later, another email came in. This time, they announced an urgent street inspection scheduled at my address for the next morning. The fact that they called it urgent was laughable. It was a parking space, a standard painted line. Nothing had changed. Nothing was blocking anything. But Karen wanted chaos, and the HOA was doing exactly what she hoped for. That evening, the tension in the neighborhood grew thicker. Cars slowed down as they passed my driveway. Some neighbors gave me sympathetic looks. Others whispered behind fences. Karen stood on her porch like she was overseeing a crime scene that only she could interpret. I sat on my couch, watching the delivery cam footage on my TV, letting the feed run while I listened to the audio. I almost forgot that my camera caught sound in addition to video. And what I heard was better than anything I could have predicted. Throughout the day, Karen had been pacing around the sidewalk near my car, rehearsing her story, adjusting her details depending on who she spoke to, and contradicting herself over and over again. She claimed at one point that my car extended halfway across the sidewalk. Another time she said pedestrians had to step into the street to get around it. Then she said joggers risk collisions. She even blamed an elderly neighbor's stubbed toe on my parking spot, even though that neighbor lived 3 houses down and hadn't walked past my driveway in weeks. The footage had everything. The lies, the dramatics, the shifting stories, and best of all, it showed the actual sidewalk, wide, unobstructed, clear the entire time. I saved the full file and backed it up 3 times. That night, the HOA group chat lit up. I wasn't in it, but a neighbor who was sent me screenshots. Karen was pushing the board to issue me a violation before the inspection even happened. She said waiting until morning was irresponsible and dangerous. Her messages got longer, more frantic, more desperate. And then she made the mistake that turned the tide entirely. She claimed she had video proof. Karen didn't know she was lying. She didn't know she'd been caught on my own camera contradicting herself for hours, and she didn't know that half the chat had already started doubting her. The chat grew heated. Someone asked to see her so-called video. She dodged the request. Another person pointed out that they'd walked by my house that morning and saw nothing blocked. Karen ignored them. By midnight, the group was split. Some members defended her, others questioned her motives. A few quietly left the conversation altogether. The tension had hit its peak, but I didn't say a word. I didn't respond to the HOA, I didn't argue with Karen, I didn't step outside or confront anyone. I let the pressure keep building because I knew the inspection tomorrow wasn't going to go how Karen expected. If anything, it would be the moment she finally lost the control she clung to so tightly. The neighborhood was silent as I finally went to bed. Karen's porch light stayed on long past midnight. She paced back and forth like she was rehearsing her lines for an opening courtroom statement. She truly believed tomorrow would be her victory. She had no idea the delivery cam she hated so much would be the thing that pulled the ground right out under her feet. The morning after the warning letter arrived felt heavier than the others. The sun came up like usual, but it didn't brighten anything. It only revealed how far the situation had drifted from frustration into something calculated. Before heading out for work, you checked your driveway twice. The car sat where it always sat, tucked in safely, nowhere near the sidewalk. It felt surreal, knowing someone was still trying to convince the world otherwise. You recorded a slow walk around on your phone, capturing every angle, making sure anyone watching your video could see you were in Pakistan and that you appreciated their support. You reminded them to like and subscribe because the story was only getting stranger. Then you locked your door and left with a strange mix of irritation and curiosity. The HOA claimed they had new evidence. That phrase rolled in your mind all day. The board had never cared about your home before. They rarely enforced anything unless it involved a fence color or a grass height. Yet here they were, acting like you were a danger to the neighborhood for parking in your own driveway. Something didn't add up. When you came home that afternoon, you found what they meant by evidence. Someone had slipped a folder under your welcome mat. Inside were printed photos, grainy ones, pictures of your car sticking over the sidewalk by at least 2 feet. Except the photos weren't real. You hadn't parked that way. The background didn't even match your house. It was your car in some other driveway, badly photoshopped into the picture. You stared at the crooked shadows, the mismatched lighting, the weird warping around the tires. It wasn't even a good edit. Whoever made it didn't care about realism. They only cared about pushing a story, and the HOA bought it, or maybe encouraged it. There was only one person in the neighborhood who had both the obsession and the free time to do something like this: Karen. She'd been lurking around since the first complaint, always pretending she was just walking her dog, even when the dog looked confused and tired and wanted to go back home. She'd record you from across the street and then duck behind a bush when you turned her way. It was painfully obvious what she was doing, but you let it slide. You hoped she would eventually get bored. She didn't. You walked over to your desk and pulled up the footage on your delivery cam. It took minutes to find what you needed. Around midnight, Karen was caught standing between your house and the neighbor's garage, pointing her phone at your driveway. Her friend held a flashlight to improve the lighting, although they didn't realize the camera had night vision. After a few minutes, they left, whispering in a hurry. It explained the grainy fakes, but not the motive. What did she really want? Why go through all this trouble? Why risk making herself look completely unhinged? You printed a few still frames from the cam footage, dated and timestamped, and slipped them into a folder of your own. If she wanted to play evidence games, you could play too. Except you didn't need to fake anything. Later that night, you took a walk to clear your head. You noticed Karen's house lit up like a security checkpoint. Lights in every window, curtains slightly open as if she wanted people to see she was watching. And she was watching. You felt her eyes on you even before you looked her way. She stood behind her blinds, pretending to adjust them, pretending she wasn't staring. You didn't engage. You didn't wave. You simply kept walking, giving her nothing to record or twist. But the quiet tension between you and her stretched tighter with every step. The next morning started with a thud on your porch. Another envelope, another letter. This one demanded you attend an urgent HOA review meeting regarding your parking violations. They framed it as mandatory. They acted like you owed them answers. Before you even finished reading, you heard footsteps behind you. Karen stood at the edge of your driveway, arms crossed, trying to look important. She didn't speak, but she lingered long enough to make sure you saw her smirk before she walked away. It felt like she already believed she had won. It felt like she thought you would cave, apologize, maybe beg. But she didn't know what you had collected. She didn't know about the delivery cam footage or the timestamps. She didn't know you recorded every moment, not to get revenge, but because the truth didn't need shaping. It only needed showing. The HOA meeting was scheduled for 2 days later in the community hall. Word spread far quicker than usual. Neighbors who barely spoke to you before stopped at your driveway to ask if the rumors were true. Some offered sympathy. A few admitted they had received similar letters from Karen in the past but were too tired to fight back. It painted a new picture of her, a pattern, not an isolated obsession. By the time the day of the meeting came, the air felt charged. Not angry, not nervous, something in between. You prepared your folder carefully, making sure every picture was in order. You checked your camera app again, confirming you had multiple backups. You didn't know how the HOA panel would react, but you knew they couldn't ignore hard evidence. Walking toward the community hall, you noticed more faces than expected. People lined the walkway, whispering, waiting. Karen stood near the entrance, holding her own folder filled with lies she thought would crush you. She gave a confident nod when you approached, as if she believed the outcome was already scripted. She was wrong, because once the door closed behind you, the truth would finally walk into the room with you. And the moment that happened, her entire narrative would start breaking apart.
Began with a shift. It didn't look dramatic at first. It didn't sound dramatic. In fact, it started with something as small as a text notification from the city code enforcement officer who had visited earlier. The message explained that he had reviewed the surveillance clip I emailed him, the one proving my car had not moved an inch for 48 hours. The moment that confirmation hit my screen, I knew the tension around my driveway was about to tilt in a direction Karen wasn't prepared for. While the neighborhood stayed quiet, word of the video had already begun circling through group chats and social pages, places where screenshots traveled faster than HOA warnings. Some neighbors were confused, others irritated, but a few were furious that someone in the community was weaponizing police resources over a harmless parked car. The misunderstanding had grown into something personal for them, and it drove a wedge between people who had lived side by side for years. That afternoon, Karen stepped outside looking confident again, unaware that the narrative had started to slip from her hands. She walked at the sidewalk with a notepad as if she were logging violations, carefully passing my driveway while pausing only long enough to glare. She didn't know the officer had already decided to escalate her misuse of the emergency line. She didn't know the HOA president had texted me an apology earlier, concerned about how far this had gone. She didn't know the neighbors she assumed supported her had begun whispering about how unstable this entire situation looked. The turning point came when a group of neighbors gathered near the mailbox. They weren't loud, they didn't argue, they simply talked with each other in a way that told me something had shifted. Their faces carried that subtle, unmistakable expression people wear when they realize someone crossed a line. Karen watched them from her porch but didn't approach. She seemed unsettled by the sudden change in energy, as if she could feel support slipping through her fingers even though nobody had said a word to her directly. Later, when evening settled in, a patrol car rolled slowly into the neighborhood, not rushing, not responding to a call, simply arriving with a calm presence that sent a ripple through the street. The same officer stepped out, the one who previously visited. He greeted a few neighbors and approached my driveway, clipboard in hand. Karen came marching from across the street, clearly ready to push her story one more time. But this time, the officer didn't look interested in repeating steps he had already taken. He stood firm, posture steady, and waited for her to stop talking. He explained in a tone that left no space for misinterpretation that he had completed a full review. The recorded timestamp showed my vehicle remained stationary for 2 full days. The sidewalk was never obstructed. No crime was committed. No parking rule was broken. And most importantly, calling 911 repeatedly over the same non-issue was unnecessary and edging dangerously close to a misuse of emergency services. Karen froze. She tried to pivot, suggesting that maybe the camera footage was altered. Maybe my car had moved in a way the system didn't detect. Maybe the angle hid something vital. But every excuse she produced was weaker than the last, and the officer shut each one down with the calm certainty of someone who had already dealt with too many similar situations. The neighbors who had quietly gathered earlier stood watching from their yards. Their expressions confirmed that the officer's words matched exactly what they had begun to suspect. Karen wasn't trying to protect the community. She wasn't defending a rule. She wasn't even responding to a genuine issue. She was targeting someone simply because she could, convinced her voice was louder than truth and her authority heavier than logic. After the officer finished addressing her, he walked back toward his patrol car, but before he left, he told me the city was officially documenting the behavior. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply a procedural note that carried weight. Karen heard every word. Her face shifted from confidence to embarrassment to something else, something unsettled and unfamiliar to her. It was the look of someone realizing the world was no longer validating her version of events. Night settled over the neighborhood with a quiet that felt different. Not peaceful, more like the stillness after a storm when debris remains scattered, but the worst of the wind has passed. I sat outside, watching porch lights turn on across the street. People walked their dogs, waved, nodded, shared polite greetings. The normal rhythm slowly returned. But Karen's house stayed dark. Not a curtain moved, not a shadow crossed her window. She wasn't in hiding. She was processing something she had never confronted before, being wrong in front of everyone. As the chapter came to a close, I knew this wasn't the end. She wasn't someone who accepted consequences easily. She wasn't someone who admitted fault or backed away. There was tension building beneath the surface, the kind that made you feel like another round was coming. Maybe she would double down. Maybe she would try something new. Maybe she would escalate in a way nobody expected. Either way, the quiet of that night wasn't closure. It was the pause before the next move.
The next morning carried a strange mix of calm and tension. The air felt lighter, but my mind was still heavy from everything that had happened the day before. I started the day the same way I always do, stepping outside with a cup of coffee and watching the neighborhood slowly wake up. Except this time, I wasn't just observing the street. I was watching for Karen. Word had spread fast. Neighbors who normally kept to themselves suddenly walked by with a little wave or a quick glance at my driveway, probably curious after hearing half the story from someone across the street. They had no idea what really unfolded, and honestly, I didn't feel like explaining it all. Not yet. My focus stayed locked on the footage I had collected. Each angle, each clip, every second mattered. The camera had been the quiet witness Karen never expected, and now it was my strongest defense. I spent part of the morning reviewing everything again to make sure nothing had been missed. Then, after confirming what I needed, I sent the files straight to the officer who had responded the night before. He replied that he'd review them and be in touch soon. Knowing that part was handled, I tried to shift my attention back to normal life. It didn't work. Not even a little. Every time I looked toward the sidewalk, I saw the faint outline of where the supposed blockage had been. The police measurements from last night told the full truth, but Karen had twisted reality so hard she had nearly made it collapse on itself. She didn't care about the sidewalk. She cared about control. By noon, the frustration started creeping back in, not because of the accusation itself, but because of what it represented. Someone willing to call 911 over a lie could escalate in ways most people wouldn't even imagine, and Karen had already proved she wasn't afraid of that escalation. I was cleaning up leaves near the driveway when I heard footsteps approaching. Slow, hesitant, dragging steps. When I looked up, it was one of the HOA board members walking along the curb like he was trying to look busy. He didn't say anything. He didn't wave. He just hovered near the edge of my property like a bird checking for danger before landing. I could tell he was nervous, and that made me nervous in return.
Eventually, he stopped pretending and stepped closer, though he kept his hands tucked behind his back like he wanted to look harmless. He didn't ask how I was doing or mention Karen by name. He simply said the board was having an emergency meeting later that evening and that I might want to attend. His tone said more than his words. Something was brewing and he wasn't sure which side of it would burn him first. He walked away before I could ask anything. That left me with a long, quiet afternoon and way too many questions. What could the board possibly be planning? Why now? Why after the police already settled the sidewalk nonsense? The more I thought about it, the more it felt like they weren't planning to address the truth. They were planning to cover it up. By late afternoon, the sky had shifted to a soft gold. Even in that warm light, I could see Karen's blinds twitching. She hadn't stepped outside once, not even to get her mail. She was hiding, but she wasn't done. People like her never stop. They pause, reset, and get ready for another angle. And I wasn't going to let her find one. I took a slow walk around my driveway, measuring everything again. I checked the curb, the sidewalk, the distance between every possible point Karen could twist into an accusation. Each measurement confirmed what I already knew. My car hadn't blocked anything, not even a fraction of an inch. Evening rolled in, and soon it was time for the meeting the board had mentioned. I didn't want to go, but I needed to. If they planned to twist the story or back up Karen, I needed to be there to stop it before things got worse. The HOA clubhouse was already buzzing when I arrived. Voices overlapped, papers shuffled, chairs scraped the floor. The board sat at the front table looking tense, and several neighbors filled the rows. A few glanced my way with curiosity, others with concern. But the one person who wasn't there? Karen. Instead, there was a neatly folded stack of papers on the board's table with her handwriting on the top sheet. She had submitted something she didn't want to say out loud, something she wanted the board to use. The meeting opened with polite motions and quick announcements, but everyone knew why the room was full. It didn't take long before the board president cleared his throat and mentioned there had been a recent incident regarding street accessibility. That bland, vague phrase snapped everyone's attention into focus. They began reading Karen's statement. Even though I knew she would lie, hearing it spoken out loud was something else entirely. According to her note, my car had fully obstructed pedestrian passage, posed a public hazard, and required immediate emergency attention. She even claimed I had refused to comply with her request to move it. It was fiction, pure fiction, and listening to it made my jaw clench. But then, something unexpected happened. Before the board could finish, a neighbor in the second row stood up, then another, and another. They had seen the footage I shared privately with a couple people. They knew the truth, and they were not willing to let the board bury it. By the time they were done, the entire room had shifted. The board wasn't looking at Karen's paper anymore. They were looking at me. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to argue. I simply handed them the printed still images and timestamp screenshots of the footage. The silence that followed was heavy and sharp, the kind of silence that made everyone realize they'd been pulled into someone else's game. The president finally exhaled and said the board would review the evidence and conclude the matter promptly. Someone else suggested Karen might need to be formally addressed for misuse of emergency services. That was the moment the meeting ended. But the story wasn't done. Everyone filed out slowly, whispering, speculating, processing what they had seen. Even the board couldn't hide the shift in their posture. Something had changed. A line had been drawn. As I walked home under the streetlights, I knew Karen was watching from her window. The blinds moved just slightly, enough to show she knew the tide was turning against her. But the one thing she didn't realize, the real consequences hadn't even started yet.
The next morning began with a strange sense of stillness, as if the neighborhood had finally run out of energy to stay angry. But the quiet didn't last. By noon, the HOA board sent out an emergency compliance alert, written with the usual dramatic tone, hinting that a serious violation was still under investigation. Even without names mentioned, everyone knew exactly who they meant. It was obvious Karen had pushed them into doubling down instead of stepping back. I watched the email land in my inbox while standing in my driveway, sipping my coffee and looking at the same street where all the chaos had started. My car sat exactly where it always had. No tire marks, no fresh movement, no signs of anything that could be interpreted as blocking a sidewalk. Only evidence to support what I already knew. None of this had been real. It was a story Karen had built in her head, then turned into a neighborhood battle. But the HOA didn't realize that the tension they were fueling was now working against them. Neighbors had reached a breaking point. Some of them stopped being quiet. Some went into their garages and dug up old cases where the board had acted without proof. Others pulled out photos and videos of past. The next morning began with a strange sense of stillness, as if the neighborhood had finally run out of energy to stay angry. But the quiet didn't last. By noon, the HOA board sent out an emergency compliance alert, written with the usual dramatic tone, hinting that a serious violation was still under investigation. Even without names mentioned, everyone knew exactly who they meant. It was obvious Karen had pushed them into doubling down instead of stepping back. I watched the email land in my inbox while standing in my driveway, sipping my coffee and looking at the same street where all the chaos had started. My car sat exactly where it always had. No tire marks, no fresh movement, no signs of anything that could be interpreted as blocking a sidewalk. Only evidence to support what I already knew. None of this had been real. It was a story Karen had built in her head, then turned into a neighborhood battle. But the HOA didn't realize that the tension they were fueling was now working against them. Neighbors had reached a breaking point. Some of them stopped being quiet. Some went into their garages and dug up old cases where the board had acted without proof. Others pulled out photos and videos of past run-ins with Karen, ones they'd never shared before, but now felt comfortable showing. By late afternoon, a small group had formed in the cul-de-sac. I stayed distant at first, but they waved me over. The group wasn't angry at me. They were tired. Tired of the pointless threats, tired of the false reports, tired of an HOA that acted like law enforcement instead of volunteers meant to keep a neighborhood in order. As they talked, I could feel the tone shifting. This wasn't gossip anymore. It was the beginning of something bigger. What no one knew was that Karen was watching from her window, her glare sharp enough to cut through glass. Even from a distance, there was something unsettled in the way she stared. It was the look of someone who felt authority slipping through their fingers and didn't know how to stop it. While neighbors discussed filing a collective complaint, Karen stormed out of her house. Her pace was quick, her jaw tight, her face flushed with the stress of losing control. She didn't walk toward us. She marched straight to my driveway. She stood on the sidewalk, staring at my car like it was an enemy she needed to defeat. Then she took out her phone, lifted it high as if performing for an invisible audience, and took photos rapid fire. She crouched, stepped closer, circled the bumper, and even stepped into the street to get a wide angle, all while muttering words the wind carried just enough to sound hostile. Neighbors froze, their conversation fading into silence. Watching her document a non-existent problem for the 7th time had become surreal. This wasn't just stubbornness anymore. It was obsession, and she wasn't even pretending otherwise. When she finally walked away, snapping a final picture with a dramatic flourish, people exchanged glances that didn't need words. It was clear to everyone now that this wasn't about sidewalks or cars or rules. It was about someone who couldn't handle being wrong. The next email from the HOA arrived an hour later. It was harsher than the last one, packed with vague threats about fines and enforcement measures. But what made it worse was the tone. The kind of tone used when someone had been pressured behind the scenes. Someone like Karen. But this time, a second email followed minutes later. Not from the board, from the neighborhood chat group that someone had quietly revived.
Screenshots of my driveway cam footage, photos from neighbors who had captured Karen's nightly inspection walks were added. Even clips from doorbell cameras showing her pacing back and forth with her flashlight were posted. People weren't holding back anymore. They were done being scared. That's when the tension snapped almost instantly. Within minutes, the neighborhood chat exploded with comments condemning the HOA's sudden aggression, questioning who was really making decisions, and demanding a meeting. Some even tagged board members directly, asking why they were acting on the claims of someone who seemed to be creating her own problems. For the first time, the HOA didn't respond. Not a single message. Not a single explanation. Not even a defensive statement. The silence spread from inboxes to driveways. Neighbors started stepping outside, gathering in small groups, talking louder than usual. Some walked past Karen's house with pointed looks. Others stayed near me, wanting updates, wanting to show support, wanting to make sure they knew I was on their side. The pressure had shifted. Karen, once the loudest voice in the neighborhood, now seemed trapped behind the walls of her own house. Her blinds closed, her front door locked, her car unmoved, her power fading. But I had a feeling she wasn't done. People like her rarely walk away. They escalate. They push harder. They look for a last chance to prove they were right all along. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the streetlights began to glow, I caught movement at the corner of my driveway. Karen stood there, phone in hand again, staring at my car with a strange, almost desperate focus. But this time, she didn't take pictures. She lifted the phone to her ear. She was calling someone. And I already knew who. The police. Again. But what I didn't know, not yet, was that this time the dispatcher would pull up her history and everything would finally break open. By the time the last week of the investigation arrived, the neighborhood tension had settled into a strange quiet. Everyone waited for the city's final report the way people wait for storm sirens to shut off. Even the HOA board, which had been loud and confident at the start, had gone nearly silent. They stopped sending emails, stopped announcing meetings, and seemed to vanish into the background. Only Karen kept pacing the sidewalks with the same determination she started with, convinced that she had uncovered something huge. The officers who visited earlier had already confirmed that my car had never touched the sidewalk. Their own measurements showed the space was fully clear, and the delivery cam footage backed me up. Still, they said they needed to complete the full complaint review before closing the case. They worked quietly during the week, stopping by occasionally to double-check angles and distances. They never looked annoyed, but they had the same look every officer gets when someone has dragged them into a situation that should never have been an emergency call in the first place. My neighbors went from frustrated to amused. A few stopped me during walks and said the whole situation felt like watching someone kick a hornet's nest only to get stung. Most of them already knew Karen had a habit of exaggerating, but even they admitted this time she had crossed a line. Calling 911 for something she could clearly see wasn't true made everyone uneasy. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. When Saturday came, the officers finally returned in uniform, clipboards in hand, their expressions firm and focused. It wasn't the casual walk-up they had done before. This time had weight to it, and somehow everyone in the neighborhood sensed it. Folks stepped out onto porches, lingered near mailboxes, and checked their curtains. Even the kids were quiet. It felt like the entire street was holding its breath. The officers asked me to bring out the delivery cam footage again. They stood on the sidewalk, reviewing the angles, confirming the exact timestamps, and comparing them with the original 911 call. There was nothing dramatic about the process, no big reveal, no surprise twist. It was calm, methodical, and final. And then they asked me the question I knew was coming. Had my vehicle ever, at any point that week, moved an inch from where it was parked? I told them the truth. Not a single inch. They nodded,
wrote it down, and walked straight toward Karen's house. The moment felt surreal. I didn't follow them. I didn't have to. The neighborhood was practically lined up along the street by then, pretending not to watch while very obviously watching. Even from a distance, we could see the tension rising at Karen's door. Her posture changed the instant she opened it. Her bravado faded when she realized the officers weren't here to congratulate her or support her claim. They were here to address her misuse of 911. The conversation was quiet from our angle, but her reaction spoke loudly. First confusion, then disbelief, then a kind of offended outrage that only she was capable of delivering. She gestured toward my house, toward the street, toward the car that had sat unmoved for days. The officers didn't react to any of it. They simply continued explaining the facts. Eventually, her voice dropped. The officers continued talking. No one else made a sound. Then they handed her a citation form. It looked thin, but it held more weight than any HOA rule she had ever tried to wave around. False emergency reporting, public resource misuse, potential fines, mandatory hearing. She froze there on her porch, speechless. It was the first time I had ever seen her without something to say. The officers finished the conversation and walked away calmly. They approached me again, thanked me for my patience, and told me the case was officially closed. They noted that my footage and measurements were not only helpful, but vital. Without it, the process would have dragged on. The delivery cam had made all the difference. Word spread through the HOA like wildfire. Not through emails or official updates from the board, but through neighbors talking in driveways, sharing the details in low, satisfied tones. People weren't cheering. They weren't celebrating her embarrassment. They were simply relieved. The whole episode showed what everyone had been feeling for a long time, but never said openly. Someone needed to be held accountable for the chaos she had been creating. In the days that followed, Karen stayed unusually quiet. She avoided the sidewalk she once patrolled with so much intensity. She avoided eye contact with the officers, and she especially avoided walking past my house where my car still sat perfectly legal and completely unmoved. But the story didn't end with her silence. The HOA board, already stretched thin by handling her constant reports, held an emergency meeting, not to punish me, not to discuss parking rules, but to address the misuse of emergency services. For the first time, the neighborhood saw a board willing to push back, embarrassed by the unwanted attention, and determined not to let this happen again. They introduced a new rule that same week. No HOA member may file a complaint, internal or external, without valid evidence. Not a rumor, not a hunch. Evidence. The crowd at the meeting applauded. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was relief. As for me, I kept everything the same. Same parking spot, same driveway, same quiet routine. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. The truth had already done the job. And every time someone walked by, they smiled a little. Not because I won anything, but because the neighborhood finally felt sane again.